She was 24 years old, and she was broke in the way that follows a long run of nearly enough, nearly stable, nearly the version of a life that would have stuck if one more thing had gone right and one fewer thing had gone wrong. Not the broke of catastrophe, the broke of accumulation, of small losses compounding the way small debts do, until the total is larger than any single item would have suggested, and the account reads a number that has a flatness to it, a finality that the individual amounts did not. She had a sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees that she had bought used from a gear shop in Tillamook for $11, because the man behind the counter had said you'll want something warmer than you think you'll need, and she had trusted him. A canvas bag with a broken handle she'd fixed with a zip tie, and a $10 bill she had been keeping since February in the small coin pocket of her jeans, the pocket inside the pocket, the one designed for a watch fob that no one uses for a watch fob anymore, kept there not as superstition exactly, but as the physical practice of a belief she had not yet found the words for, which was that having one thing in reserve, one thing that had not yet been spent, was a way of remaining a person who still had options. And with that $10, Maren Solis bought a keeper's cottage on the Oregon coast outside a town called Rooks Point that the Tillamook County Land Office had been trying to transfer since 2016. A cottage and, attached to it by a covered stone walkway that had lost most of its covering in the storms of 2019. A fog bell tower that the county's own file described as a separate structure. Historically significant, access limited, interior condition unknown, which was the official way of saying that nobody had been inside it since the bell mechanism had been decommissioned in 1961 and the access door had been fitted with a lock that nobody seemed to have a key for. The people of Rooks Point said the keeper's cottage was a beautiful ruin, which is the thing people say about coastal buildings they have decided are too far gone to save, but are too striking to dismiss entirely. The county structural report said the cottage was repairable and the tower was unknown, and together they represented a liability the county could not afford to insure at current rates. What no one in Rooks Point knew, and what there was no occasion for anyone to know, was that inside the fog bell tower, through the access door, up 12 iron rungs to the bell platform, and behind the bell mechanism housing in the space between the housing and the tower's outer stone wall, a woman named Dorothea Voss had left something on the last day of her tenure as keeper. In the autumn of 1961, packed into a copper box she had sealed with solder and wrapped in oilskin and placed in that specific space because she had understood, in the clear-eyed way of a woman who had kept the light and the bell through 31 winters on the Oregon coast, that the space between a bell housing and a stone wall is one of the driest and most protected places a coastal building offers, and that if you want something to last, you put it where the structure itself is working hardest to survive, and you trust the structure. Something that would change Maren Solis's life in ways she was not ready to predict, and would prove, to the people who had watched her accumulate those small losses without offering anything useful, that accumulation works in both directions, and that what looks like an ending is sometimes the last thing before a beginning so good it was worth all of it. If this kind of story reaches you tonight, a story about what is waiting in the places that have been locked and left and given up on, we'd love it if you subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from tonight. We read every one. Maren Solis had grown up in Portland, the oldest of 3 children in a household that had a quality she would spend years trying to describe accurately, and would eventually describe as managed scarcity, not poverty, not dysfunction, but the particular atmosphere of a family in which the resources were always slightly less than what the situation required, and the awareness of this was never entirely absent from any room. Her father, Toms, worked in logistics for a trucking company and was a man of genuine competence in his field and limited range outside it. A person for whom the world functioned best when it was organized and predictable, and who experienced its failures to be organized and predictable as personal affronts requiring considerable interior management. Her mother, Rosa, taught 4th grade and was warm in the way that good elementary teachers are warm. A practiced, capacious warmth that could hold 30 children at once, and that had room for her own 3 at home, though the room was sometimes thinner than she wanted because she had been using most of it all day. Marin was, of the 3, the one who felt the managed scarcity most acutely, possibly because she was the oldest and had been aware of it before the others were old enough to notice. Possibly because her particular nature, she was the kind of person who located herself in relation to everything around her, who needed to know where things were and how stable they were before she could be at ease, was sensitive to the ambient uncertainty in a way her siblings were not. She was not unhappy. She was attentive in a way that is sometimes mistaken for unhappiness, because it does not look like ease. She had gone to Portland State on student loans and a partial grant, and had studied marine biology because the ocean had always seemed to her the largest and most honest thing she had access to. Honest in the sense that it did not pretend to be other than what it was, which was vast and indifferent and full of systems that worked on their own logic whether or not anyone was watching. She had graduated with a degree she was proud of, and a debt she was realistic about, and had spent 2 years working at an aquarium in Astoria, and then a year with a coastal restoration nonprofit, and then 8 months contract to contract with a marine research station that had lost its state funding and was in the process of closing. She had spent the 8 months after that doing odd jobs along the coast, retail, kitchen work, a winter of driving a shuttle van between coastal towns, and had arrived at 24 with the accumulated deficit of nearly, of close, but not quite, of a path that had been reasonable at every step and had arrived somewhere she had not intended. She had been living in her car for 6 weeks when she found the listing for the keeper's cottage, not the kind of car living that is a lifestyle choice, the kind that happens when your lease runs out and the next apartment's deposit is 3 months away and the van shifts end at midnight, and starting again at 6 makes an apartment a place to sleep, and a car a place to sleep. And the car wins on cost. She had the sleeping bag from the Tillamook gear shop, and she managed, and she was not broken by it, but she was ready for it to be over, and over needed a shape before it could become real. The listing was on the county surplus site, which she had been checking the way she checked several things: weather, tides, the Marine Research Station's job board, out of habit and without expectation. The keeper's cottage had been on the site since 2016 and had been viewed, according to the counter on the listing page, 47 times in 8 years without resulting in a transfer, which told her something she found useful. The obstacle was not indifference. 47 people had looked. Something about looking had not become doing, and she wanted to know what. She read the file. She read the structural report. She read the note about the fog bell tower and the locked access door, and the interior condition unknown, and she thought about that specifically, about what interior condition unknown means when the structure in question has been built to withstand the Oregon coast in winter for the better part of a century, which is to say it means the interior condition is probably fine, because if the tower were not fine, the county would know it, because it would have fallen down. She went to the Tillamook County Land Office on a Thursday. The land officer was a woman named Ann Reeves, who had been in the office for 12 years, and who had the quality Marin had learned to recognize in people who do institutional work with genuine care. A combination of procedure and attention. The ability to follow the form while still seeing the person in front of her. Anne found the file with the ease of a file that has been found before, and set it on the counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who has given this presentation and is giving it again. The keeper's cottage. Built in 1887, 1.5 stories, 4 rooms, stone foundation, wood frame, slate roof with 2 repaired sections and 1 section on the south side that wanted attention. Structurally sound. The interior had been assessed in 2015 and found to be in poor condition. Plaster damage, floor damage in the northwest room from a leak since repaired. All original fixtures intact, including the cast iron range in the kitchen. The covered walkway to the tower, the cedar covering, had failed in the 2019 storms, and the stone base remained. The tower, 1892 construction, stone, 31 feet, fog bell mechanism, decommissioned 1961. Bell still in place. Interior access via iron rung ladder. Condition of interior unknown because the access door at the tower base had been locked at decommissioning, and the key had not been located in county records. Anne said the county would take $10. She said, "Has anyone tried to open the tower door?" Anne checked the file. The 2015 inspector noted the locked door and did not attempt access. The 2022 inspector noted the locked door and did not attempt access. She looked up. There's a note from the first inspector that says the lock appears to be a standard padlock of older manufacture. Marin thought about this. An older padlock on a door that had been locked since 1961. She thought about what an older padlock means after 60 years of salt air on the Oregon coast, which was that the padlock was very likely something she could address with the right tool. She put the $10 bill on the counter. It came from the watch fob pocket, still folded small, and Anne looked at it for a moment before picking it up, the way people sometimes look at a thing that has been kept carefully. "Welcome to Rook's Point," Anne said, and stamped the form. Marin drove to the keeper's cottage that afternoon. The road from the county road was a mile of gravel that ran along the headland above the ocean, with the tower visible for the last quarter mile before the cottage, the stone tower rising from the headland's edge with the ocean behind it. Gray in the March light, the bell visible at the top as a dark shape against the sky. She parked and got out and stood for a while in the wind, which was the kind of coastal wind that means business, and that she had grown to respect in her years along the coast, and looked at the tower and the cottage and the covered walkway that was now a stone path with remnant cedar posts standing at intervals. The cottage key was in the file, a modern key, cut when the county had taken the property. She unlocked the front door into a room that smelled of salt and old wood and the specific mineral character of stone walls that have absorbed decades of coastal air. And she moved through the rooms with the systematic attention she had developed in fieldwork, noting what was there and what was not, and what each meant. The cast iron range was there, and it was sound. The plaster was damaged in the northwest room, patchy rather than collapsed. The floors were wide plank pine, dry and stable except in the damaged room where the old leak had worked on 2 boards that wanted replacing. She went up the half-story to the sleeping room, which had a window facing west that looked directly at the tower, and she stood at that window and looked at the tower for a long time. She went out through the back of the cottage and along the stone walkway to the tower base. The access door was set into the tower's south face, low and heavy, built from the same era as the decommissioning, 1961 vintage, solid steel, with a padlock through a hasp. The padlock was, as the inspection note had said, older manufacture. And it was also exactly what 60 years of salt air does to older manufacture, which is to render it largely ornamental. It was orange-brown, thoroughly corroded, the shackle fused to the body in the way of metal that has been asked to perform a function it is no longer capable of performing. She had brought a bolt cutter from the gear shop in Tillamook, the same place she had bought the sleeping bag, and the padlock gave at the first cut with the sound of something that had been waiting to give for a long time. The door swung inward, stiffly, and the smell that came out was stone and metal, and something she identified after a moment as old rope. The bell pull, she understood. The line that had once allowed the keeper to ring the bell from the cottage, still coiled on a hook inside the door. She stepped in and let her eyes adjust to the dimness. The tower interior was a single shaft of stone, 31 feet. The iron-rung ladder on the north side going up to the bell platform. The bell mechanism housing, the frame that had held the automated ringing apparatus before decommissioning, was still in place at the top, a heavy iron structure bolted to the platform floor, the bell hanging above it. She climbed the 12 rungs and stood on the platform and looked at the bell and then at the mechanism housing and then at the gap between the housing and the tower wall. The gap was perhaps 14 inches, deep enough. Dry, the tower had a conical stone cap with a lead flashing that had kept the weather out, and the stone was dry to the touch, and the air in the gap was the still, preserved air of a space that has been sealed and dry for a long time. She reached into the gap. Her hand met copper. She worked the box out carefully. It was perhaps 10 inches by 8 by 6, sealed with solder at every seam, wrapped in oilskin tied with copper wire that had gone green but held. She brought it down the ladder and carried it out of the tower and sat on the stone walkway base with the ocean visible over the headland edge and opened the oilskin. The copper box was intact. The solder seal was intact. She worked at the lid with a pocket knife, careful not to force, feeling for the seam rather than cutting it, and the solder gave along the top edge, and she lifted the lid. Inside, a cloth-wrapped packet, a small book, cloth-bound, the cloth faded, and an envelope, facing up, in a handwriting that was upright and deliberate, and had the quality of someone who had written in conditions that required steadiness, at sea, perhaps, or in wind, and had made steadiness a habit. On the envelope, for the next keeper, she sat on the stone walkway in the March wind with the ocean below, and opened the envelope. Dorothea Voss had been the keeper at Rook's Point from 1930 until the decommissioning in 1961. She had taken the position at 26, which she noted was young for a keeper and female, which she noted was still unusual in 1930, and which had required, she wrote, a degree of documentation of her competence that her male counterparts had not been asked to provide, a requirement she had met with a thoroughness she had, since come to regard as its own reward, since the documentation had proven useful multiple times in the 31 years that followed. She had kept the light and the fog bell through 31 winters of Oregon coast weather, which she described with the matter-of-fact precision of someone for whom severe coastal weather is not dramatic but technical. A set of conditions requiring specific responses, each of which she had learned and refined, and in some cases invented, because the standard response was inadequate to the specific situation she faced. She had loved the work. She wrote this with the simplicity of a person who has spent 31 years confirming something and no longer needs to qualify it. She had loved the particular knowledge that the light and the bell were doing what they were meant to do, that ships in fog and darkness had the signal they needed, that the function she maintained was the difference, in specific and verifiable instances, between passage and wreck. She had never met the people her work protected. She had known they were there by the ships she could hear in the fog and the ships she could see in the clear. And she had understood that this was the nature of the work. You do it for people you will not know, in conditions that do not care whether you are comfortable, because the alternative is that the ships don't have what they need, and that consequence is not acceptable. She had, she wrote, also been doing something else. In the 31 years she had kept the light at Rook's Point, she had been observing the ocean, not casually. She was not a casual observer of anything, but with the systematic attention of someone who has decided that a position on a headland above the Pacific, maintained without interruption across 3 decades, represents a scientific opportunity that would be wasteful to ignore. She had been recording the things the ocean told her, the behavior of the swells, and what it indicated about weather systems hundreds of miles distant, the migration patterns of gray whales, and what she could infer from their timing and their routes. The seasonal behavior of the seabirds that used the headland, species by species, year by year. The patterns of the kelp forest she could see in clear conditions from the Bell platform, its extent and its variation across 30 years, the temperature of the water as she could infer it from the behavior of the species she observed, before instruments for direct measurement were standard equipment for a keeper's station. She had been doing this because she thought it was important, and because she was there, and no one else was there, and if she didn't do it, no one would, which was reasoning she found sufficient. The small cloth-bound book was the record, a logbook she wrote, 31 years of daily entries, the handwriting becoming smaller and denser as the years went on, and the margins became reference rather than blank space. Every whale sighting, every significant storm, with her assessment of the swell before the storm's visible arrival, and the accuracy of her prediction after. Every seabird breeding season, and her count of nesting pairs. Every spring when the kelp came back, and the shape it came back in, and what that shape said about what had happened in the water since the previous spring. She had sent a summary of the first 20 years to the Marine Biology Department at Oregon State in 1950. The department had replied with a polite letter acknowledging receipt and had not followed up, which she wrote about without bitterness. She was a woman who understood the institutions of science as they existed in 1950 and had not expected much, and had therefore not been disappointed. She had continued recording because the recording was the right thing to do regardless of whether the institution was interested. There was also, she wrote, money in the cloth, wrapped packet. She said this in the same tone as everything else. Information, delivered clearly, because it was relevant. She had been paid a keeper's salary for 31 years, and had spent very little of it, because the cottage was provided, and the ocean was free, and her needs were specific and modest, and most of what she needed was attention and time, which were free. She had saved, and she had invested through the Oregon State Credit Union in instruments she understood, and she had let them accumulate. She had tried, in 1961, to find a proper way to leave the money somewhere useful, and had found the legal machinery for doing so more resistant than the weather on a January night. And so she had put it in the box, and put the box in the tower, and trusted the tower, which she trusted more than most things, and had left. She hoped. She wrote that whoever found the box was someone who could use the logbook, someone who understood what 31 years of continuous coastal observation meant, and would put it in the hands of people who could use it. She had been thinking, in 1961, that the logbook might eventually be of interest to the marine science that was developing rapidly in those years. And she had been right, though right in the way of people who are right before the field catches up to them, which is a specific and not always comfortable form of being right. She hoped whoever found it lived in the cottage for a long time. She said the northwest room leaked when the wind came from a certain direction, and you had to watch for it. She said the cast iron range drew well if you kept the flue clean, which she had done every September. She said the Bell platform was the best place on the headland for watching the weather come in, and she recommended watching it come in at least once, because understanding what was coming gave you time to decide what to do about it, which was, she thought, broadly applicable. She closed by saying she was sorry to leave. Marin sat on the stone walkway for a long time after she finished reading. She opened the cloth-wrapped packet. The bills inside were currency from the late 1950s and early 1960s. Banded and still intact, she counted them, and they came to just over $3,000 in bills that remained legal tender. Beneath the bills, folded once, were 3 certificates of deposit from the Oregon State Credit Union, matured in the 1970s and since untouched. she would find when she drove to the credit union in Tillamook the following week and sat with a branch manager named Clara Obasi, who handled the situation with the quiet precision of someone for whom unusual is simply a description rather than an obstacle, that the certificates had been accruing interest for 50 years on the terms of their original issue, and that the total current value was $94,300. Clara had looked at the logbook, which Marin brought because she wanted someone else to see it, and had said she kept this for 31 years? Every day, Marin said. Clara had looked at it for a moment. That's something, she said, in the tone of a person who means it precisely. She contacted the Oregon Institute of Marine Biology on a Friday afternoon by email and described the logbook in enough detail that the researcher who responded, a woman named Dr. Fiona Marsh, who studied long-term coastal ecosystem change, said she needed to see it, and could Marin come to the Institute on Monday. Marin drove to Coos Bay on Monday with the logbook in an archival sleeve she had bought from an art supply store in Tillamook. Because the logbook deserved the protection of being in a proper sleeve, and she sat across from Dr. Marsh while Dr. Marsh read it. Dr. Marsh read for 2 hours. When she looked up, she said that what Marin had was a 31-year continuous observational record of the Rooks Point headland, taken from a fixed position across the full seasonal cycle from 1930 to 1961. She said that the pre-1960 baseline for Pacific Northwest coastal ecosystems was one of the most significant gaps in the regional literature. She said that Dorothea Voss had been recording the things that had been identified as the most important things to record decades before the field had identified them as such. She said, "Does she have living descendants?" Marin had looked into this. Dorothea had a great-niece in Bend, a woman named Gloria who was 72 and whom Marin had called the previous week. Gloria had said, when Marin described what she had found, Aunt Dot always said the tower had good bones. She had never said anything else about what was in it. Dr. Marsh wanted to publish. Marin said yes, with the conditions that had become her template. Dorothea Voss's name first, described as the primary researcher, the original logbook to remain with the keeper's cottage, the publication in open access. Dr. Marsh agreed without reservation. The roof she fixed in April. She hired a roofer from Tillamook named Sam Birch, who drove out and looked at the south section and said it was 2 days and named a fair price and did it on the first clear week. The slate matched from a salvage operation in Newport that Sam knew. She repaired the northwest room herself. 2 new floorboards, patched plaster. The work of a person who has learned to do things because there is no one else to do them, and who has found, in that learning, something she did not expect to find, which was a specific satisfaction. The satisfaction of a problem solved by your own hands in the right order. She fixed the cedar covering on the walkway over 2 weekends, new cedar posts and rails, the covering itself a tongue and groove that she fitted herself, and that kept the weather off the stone path the way the original had. She kept the stone clean and the drain clear, and the cast iron range clean at the flue, every September, as instructed. She moved in. The sleeping room's west window looked at the tower, and she looked at the tower every evening, which was a thing she found she wanted to do and did not examine closely, because some wants do not improve under examination. She had the logbook on the shelf above the desk in the main room, the original in the archival sleeve, beside the copy that Dr. Marsh's team had made and which was now being worked through by 4 researchers who had, in the 8 months since the first email, found in Dorothea's 31 years of entries things they had not known how to look for in other data, and were now finding ways to look for everywhere. She had the bell pulled once, in November, in a storm that came from the west at 3 in the morning and was exactly the kind of storm for which fog bells were invented. The darkness and the spray making the world at the headland edge a wall of nothing except the sound of what was happening. And she pulled the bell rope, and the bell rang out over the water. And she understood. In the way of understanding that is physical rather than intellectual, what Dorothea had meant about the function being the difference between passage and wreck. The bell was not connected to anything now. The ships had GPS. But the bell rang, and the sound went out over the water, and she stood in the tower with the rope in her hands and felt the continuity of the thing. The chain of keepers. The chain of winters. The chain of attention that Dorothea had kept, and that she was keeping now, differently but in the same place, for the same reason, which was that someone should be paying attention, and she was the someone who was here. On the first Saturday of every month, she drove to the Tillamook County Land Office and stopped at Ann Reeves's desk. She brought two things: a printout of whatever the research team had published or was working on, a finding from the logbook, a species count, a storm correlation, and a bag of coffee from the roaster in Rook's Point. Because Anne had been the person who stamped the form and said welcome, and Marin thought the people who say welcome to things deserve to hear how the things are going. Anne always read the printout, and always had a question, and the question was always a good one, which told Marin something about Anne that she had already suspected. Her father called in June. Tom Solis had heard from Rosa, who had heard from Marin's younger sister, who had seen a mention of the Rook's Point logbook in a marine science newsletter that had been shared in a Facebook group that Rosa was in for unrelated reasons. And the mention had included Marin's name in the acknowledgments as the person who had brought the logbook to the Institute's attention. And Rosa had shown it to Tom's, and Tom's had called, because Tom's processed things by calling, which was something Marin had known her whole life and had not always had the patience for, and had more patience for now. He said he had read about the logbook. She told him about it, about Dorothea Voss and the 31 years, and the bell tower and the copper box, and the way the solder had held across 63 years of salt air. She told him about the gray whale sightings, and the kelp, and the storm predictions, and what Dr. Marsh had said about the pre-1960 baseline. She told him about the bell in the November storm. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that Tom's was quiet. Not absence, but processing. The way a man for whom the world functions best when it is organized holds something new and tries to find where it goes. Then he said, "She did all of that, and nobody knew. She tried once," Marin said. In 1950. Oregon State wrote back a polite letter. He was quiet again. Then, "And you found it." "I cut the padlock," Marin said. Ann Reeves at the land office told me it was older manufacture. I thought about what 60 years of salt air does to older manufacture. Another quiet. She could hear the managed scarcity house in it, the careful father who had given her the habit of thinking about what conditions do to things over time, about what accumulates and what erodes, which was, she realized, in the quiet on the phone with her father, exactly the same thinking that had led her to cut the padlock rather than give up on the door. "I'm proud of you," he said. Not easily. With the effort of a man for whom that sentence requires assembly, which was, she thought, its own form of worth. She was 24 years old, and she was broke in the way that follows a long run of nearly. That was where the story had started. In a car with a sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees and a $10 bill in the watch fob pocket and 6 weeks of the parking lot life that she had managed and had been ready to be done with. But that was not what the story was. The story was about 31 years of daily attention, maintained in the dark and the fog and the salt, by a woman who understood that the work was for people she would never meet, and who did it anyway because the ships needed the signal and the ocean needed the record, and someone who was there and paying attention had an obligation that was not diminished by the absence of an audience. Marin understood this. She had understood it on the Bell platform with the logbook in her hands, and she understood it now, in November, standing at the window of the sleeping room looking at the tower in the rain. The tower that had held what it was given to hold for 63 years. The stone dry inside, the copper sound, the solder intact, the bell still hanging at the top of the shaft where Dorothea had last rung it in 1961, and where Marin had rung it once in a November storm at 3 in the morning, because she was the keeper now, and keeping was what she was for. The ocean did not care. The ocean was vast and indifferent and full of systems that worked on their own logic whether or not anyone was watching. She was watching. That was the thing. She was watching, and she was writing it down, and every month the research team sent her a question from the logbook that required her to go to the Bell platform and look at what was there now and compare it to what Dorothea had seen. And the comparison was the data. And the data was the point. And the point was that you could know things about the ocean if you were patient and present, and you did not stop. She was not going to stop. If this story reached you tonight, if it made you think of someone who kept a careful record of something important that no one asked them to keep, or a moment when what looked like a locked door turned out to be a door that hadn't been tried the right way yet, we'd love it if you subscribed and shared this with someone who needs to hear it today. And in the comments, tell us this. Is there something you have been paying attention to, quietly and consistently, that you think deserves to be written down? We'd love to hear about it. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next one.